Morning, grandchildren. It's Thursday now, and we finished our last book, and so I thought we'd read a book that was one of my favorites when I was a little boy. And just to give you a little background story, my dad redid the plaster in our downstairs living room and dining room, and he piled all the furniture in the middle of the room so he could get to all the walls, and covered everything in the middle, all the furniture with tarps, and took all the plaster off the walls and redid it all. Well, during the time he was doing that, my little sister Julie and I would crawl underneath the tarp and push the furniture around enough that we could get a cord out to plug in the record player, and we listened to this book on an old record player under the tarps with flashlights, and we thought it was great. So anyway, we listened to the Three Little Pigs and the Grasshopper and the Ant and a bunch of other stories that Mom had bought on records, and this little Toot story was one that she had bought on record, and I don't know where it ever got to, but check this book out from our library. It's a little bit different, but it's almost the same thing that was done. I believe the original copyright was 1948. So it's an old book, but it's one that I enjoyed when I was a little boy. So this is entitled Little Toot, and there's a picture of Little Toot. I'll try and show you the pictures as we read through the story. The record player that we had songs on it, so I'm going to try and sing a song for you. Little Toot was just a tug, just a happy harbor tug, and he came from a line of tugboats fine and brave. But it seemed that little Toot simply didn't give a hoot. Though he tried to be good, he never could behave. Well, at the foot of an old wharf lives the cutest, silliest little tugboat you ever saw. A very handsome tugboat with a brand new candy stick smokestack. His name was Little Toot. Now this name came to him through no fault of his own. Blow hard as he could, all he could get out was a little toot toot. Here's a picture of Little Toot. But what he couldn't create in sound, Little Toot made up for in smoke. From his chubby smokestack, he would send up a volley of smoke balls which bubbled over his wake like balloons. Hence, he got all steamed up. When he got all steamed up, Little Toot used to feel very important. There's a picture of Little Toot. His smoke balls that he could blow out his stack. Then when he was blowing his smoke balls, his masthead would dance like the tail of a puppy dog when he was happy, and he flaunted his signals like a man of war. There's Little Toot's signals. Now the river where Little Toot lives is full of ships. They come from ports all over the world bringing crews who, some of them speak some pretty strange languages, and they brought even stranger cargoes, hides from Buenos Aires, copra from the South Seas, whale oil from the Antarctic, fragrant teas from distant Asia. So there was always a lot of work to be done all around the harbors, and tugboats were the ones who pushed the ships into the docks to be unloaded, or pulled them into the stream down the channel so they could go down the river to the ocean past the harbor. Here's a picture of some of the boats. So a tugboat's life was a busy, exciting life, and Little Toot was properly right in the middle of all of it. His father, Big Toot, was the biggest, fastest tugboat on the river, while Big Toot could make more smoke and kick up more water than any two tugboats put together. There's Big Toot. As for Grandfather Toot, he was an old sea dog who breathes smoke and tells mighty deeds of things that he did in days past along the river. There's Grandpa. You'd think that little Toot, belonging to such an important family, would have his mind on work, but no, he didn't. Little Toot hated work. He saw no sense in pulling ships 50 times bigger than himself all the way up and down the river to go to the ocean, and he was scared of the wild seas that lay in wait outside the channel beyond where the harbor empties into the ocean. Little Toot had no desire to be tossed around. He preferred the calm water of the river. And there, he could always find plenty of fun, like gliding, for example. Little Toot could glide up on the waves as he wanted to, or he could play thread the needle around the piers. What was even fancier was doing figure eights. There he is playing thread the needle, and there he is making figure eights. Little Toot liked nothing better than to make a really fine figure eight. First you throw all your weight over on one side, and then you throw all your weight over on the other side, and the result never failed to delight little Toot, although his antics did annoy the hard-working tugboats something terrible. When he kept on making figure eights, he grew bigger and bigger. The figure eights grew bigger and bigger until one day, carried away by the joy of it all, he made one so big it took up the whole river. Indeed, there was hardly even room between the two shores. Look at this figure eight. That's a big figure eight, isn't it? From one shore to the other shore. And there was no room for all the big tugboats. One particular tugboat named J.G. McGillicuddy, which was bound downstream to pick up a string of coal barges from Hoboken. J.G. McGillicuddy had no love for other tugboats anyway, and a frivolous one like little Toot just made him mad. As witness, look at this picture. J.G. McGillicuddy was not happy. This by itself was bad enough, but unfortunately for little Toot, the other tugboats had seen what had happened, so they began to make fun of him, calling him a sissy who only knew how to play games. Here's the other tugboats making fun of him. Poor little Toot. He was ashamed and angry, and there was really nothing he could do about it, because all he knew how to do was blow those silly smoke balls. But the more he blew, the more the other boats laughed, and little Toot just couldn't stand it anymore, so he fled to his favorite hiding place alongside the wharf where his taunting friends couldn't reach him, and there he just sat and he sulked. And the more he sulked, he moped. And after he moped for a while, he just got so discouraged. Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? When there's work to be done, all you think of is fun. Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? Here's a picture of him down by the wharf, feeling sorry for himself. Well, after he'd moped for quite a while, little Toot saw headed down the river a great big ocean liner. Wow, look at that one. So, pulling it were 4 great big tugboats, and his own father, Big Toot, was right up front, pulling the big ship. The sight of the brave, bustling work made little Toot think, and he thought harder than he'd ever thought in his whole life. And then all of a sudden a great idea burst into him. He wouldn't be a silly, frivolous little tugboat playing games all the time anymore. He would work just like the rest of them. After all, wasn't he the son of Big Toot, the mightiest tugboat on the river? Well, He'd make Big Toot very proud of him. He'd show 'em all. So, full of ambition, he started eagerly downstream. There he goes. He sidled up hopefully to one of the big ships, one big ship after another, tooting for them to heave him a tow line. But they knew him, and they all supposed he was still just a silly little nuisance, and they'd have nothing to do with him. Oscar the Scandinavian rudely blew steam in his face. And the others were way too busy with their own affairs to even notice a bothersome little tug like little Toot. They knew him too well. They knew what he'd do. But the rudest of all was the transatlantic liner that blasted him right out of the water. That was just too much for little Toot, and he wasn't wanted anywhere or by anybody, so, with his spirits drooping, he just let the tide carry him where it willed. He was so lonesome. He was floating aimlessly downstream, and he grew sadder and sadder until he made himself completely miserable. He was sunk so deep in his own despair, he didn't even notice the sky getting dark. He didn't notice the wind was whipping up. There was a real storm on the horizon. Look at this. Black clouds, and little Toot just feeling so sorry for himself because nobody wanted him because he'd been playing games all the time, wouldn't do any work. Suddenly he heard a sound that was unlike any sound he'd ever heard before. It was the ocean. The great big ocean that little Toot had never seen. And the noise came from the waves as they dashed and pounded against the rocks. Oh my goodness. Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? When you get into trouble, you get into it double. Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? What a shame, what a shame. You disgraced your father's name. Won't you ever grow up, little Toot? Well, suddenly, in all that black storm and in all the clouds, a rocket climbed up into the sky, a brilliant flaming rocket. Well, when little Toot looked real hard, he saw jammed between the rocks there on the shore an ocean liner that he recognized his father had hauled up and down the river several times. It was stuck on the rocks. What could little Toot do? It was truly a terrible sight to see, and little Toot went wild with excitement. He began puffing those silly smoke balls out of his smokestack, but that's all he'd ever learned how to do. As he did, a wonderful thought struck him. Why, those smoke balls could possibly be seen way up the river where his father and grandfather were. So he puffed out a signal. Way upriver, they saw it. SOS. Of course, they had no idea who was making those signals, but they knew what it meant. It meant come quickly. So they all dropped what they were doing to race to the rescue. And out from many of the wharfs steamed a whole fleet of boats, big boats and little boats, and fat boats and skinny boats. All kinds of boats. And right in the front was Big Toot himself, leading the way like an admiral of a fleet. There's Big Toot going down there. Just in time, too, because little Toot, still puffing out his SOS signal, was hard pressed to stay afloat. Here comes the fleet, and there's little Toot out there trying to puff his SOS, and it's getting to be pretty hard for him just to stay afloat. One wave spun him around till he was dizzy, and another one tossed him up so high he was glad when he found another spiral-shaped wave just to come down and glide down on. Before he could spit out the salt water from his smokestack, still another wave came along and tossed him back up again. It looked as though he'd never get down this time. Look at little Toot getting tossed around in the waves. And all this was pretty awful for a tugboat that was used to the smooth water of the river. And what made it even more terrifying was the fact that out of the corner of his eye, when he was thus hung up on one of those big waves, little Toot saw that the fleet wasn't doing any better, making any headway against the fierce seas. Even Grandfather Toot was bellowing that he'd never seen such a storm, and little Toot was scared green. Here's Grandfather Toot. And there's little Toot. Scared green. Something had to be done. But all that little Toot had ever learned how to do was blow those silly smoke balls. There he was, and there was this channel, kind of like a narrow bottleneck, and the whole ocean was trying to pour in all at once, and nobody could get out of the harbor to get to the ocean where the ocean liner was. The fleet couldn't make any headway. The force of the seas just simply swept him right back. Indeed, they were on the verge of giving up altogether when suddenly above the storm they heard a gay familiar toot toot. It was little Toot. Not wasting his strength butting against the waves as they had all done, but bouncing from the crest of one wave to the crest of another wave like a rubber ball. The pounding hurt like everything, but little Toot kept right on going, and when Big Toot looked out through his sea binoculars and saw little Toot and the crew on the vessel throw little Toot a line, he was so proud. There's a view through the binoculars of Big Toot. It was a wonderful thing to see. When the line was made fast, little Toot waited for a long moment. And finally, when a huge wave swept under the liner, it lifted it a little bit. Little Toot pulled. Pull. Pull. And they made it. And then a huge wave swept under the liner and lifted it clear of the rocks. He pulled with all his might, and the liner came free. And here's a picture of little Toot pulling the liner. The people on board began to cheer, and the whole tugboat fleet insisted on little Toot's escorting the great big boat back up to the harbor. Here's the ocean liner, and little Toot pulling it. And here's all the other tugboats, all happy that little Toot pulled the ocean liner free from the rocks. Little Toot was a hero, and Grandfather Toot blasted the news all up and down the river. There's proud Grandpa. Well, after that, little Toot became quite a different fellow. He even changed his tune. Well, it seems you've grown up, little Toot. You're a brave Toot, little Toot. Can't you hear that cheering crowd? You have made your daddy proud. Now you're a big toot, little toot. Yes, now you're a great big toot, little toot. It's said that little Toot could haul as big a load as his father could haul. Well, that is when Big Toot didn't have a very big load to haul. And that's the end of our story. Well, I hope you enjoyed my story, Little Toot. I used to enjoy listening to it when I was a little boy, so I hope you enjoyed it too. It's my opportunity to tell you, be good. Honor the Lord Jesus Christ with your life. And Grandpa is proud of you. Take care. Bye.